Hello everyone. Welcome to Net Diligence Virtual Cyber Risk Summit. My name is Heather Osborne and I'm the Director of Global Events and Programming at Net Diligence, a cyber risk assessment and data breach services company. Net Diligence is pleased to bring our thought-leading content to the virtual space with this new webinar series. Visit our website at www.netdiligence.com to get more information about our upcoming webinars and in-person events. Before we begin, I'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our virtual Cyber Risk Summit sponsors, particularly Aspen Insurance, our diamond sponsor. I'd also like to thank our 100+ speakers for bringing their thought leadership to our program. For today's webinar, we will be using the On24 platform. Right now, you should be viewing the On24 dashboard, which shows the live viewing screen. During the webcast, all participants will be in listen-only mode. Today's presentation is slated for approximately 45 minutes, with 15 minutes at the end for questions. Our panel of speakers will be taking questions throughout the session via the questions widget. Please type in questions during the presentation and click submit. If your question is of immediate import or concerns technical problems, you will receive an immediate answer by text. You can also find a widget entitled Resources, where you can download assets provided by the speakers and sponsors for each webinar. Just click the resource in the box and it will be automatically downloaded. If you are interested in receiving CLE or CE accreditation for this program, you must stay on for the full duration of the webinar and answer 3 polling questions that will appear during the course of the program. Additionally, please fill out the participant information questions. This will ensure that you are correctly matched to the state and professional organization. As a reminder, this webcast is being recorded. After the presentation, you will receive an archive link for further review or for sharing. The webinar will also be available for future viewing on our website. Again, thank you for joining the Net Diligence Virtual Cyber Risk Summit. We hope you enjoy the program.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the virtual Net Diligence webinar, Crisis Communications, PR, and Reputational Harm. My name is David Molitano. I am from Berkeley Cyber Risk Solutions, and I have the privilege and honor in moderating today's panel. I would like the panel to introduce themselves. So Kim, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Dave. Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Holmes. I lead business development at TDC Specialty for healthcare, cyber liability, and emerging risks.
Gina?
Hi, this is Gina Valdetero. I'm a partner at the law firm Bryan Cave Leighton Paisner, and I co-chair the firm's data privacy and security team.
Thanks, Gina. Jamie?
Hello, everyone. This is Jamie Singer. I'm a Senior Vice President on Edelman's Crisis and Risk Team, as well as one of the senior leads of our U.S. Data Security and Privacy Group.
Thanks, Jamie. Sandra?
Hi, everyone. I am a member of the Corporate Communications Department for Experian, the nation's largest credit bureau. And as part of my role, I have led communications efforts for our data breach resolution group for about 7 years and counseled some of our clients on PR strategies.
Great, thank you. As everyone can see, we have a very experienced, well-known group of panelists who bring different experiences, different ideas to the table, so I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's thoughts. What we're going to start out with now is a poll question for everyone who's listening, is how many breaches can you recall that had poor PR responses? And for any of our panelists, do you have any number that comes to mind? For myself, I can think of 3 immediately, not as in my role, but just as a customer or client hearing about them, thinking they could have done better.
Yeah, this is Gina. I agree. I would probably put it in the lower end of the category, but in part because what we're thinking of are major security breaches where you would have paid attention to the PR response as opposed to the majority of breaches, which often don't garner media and public attention in quite the same way. But I'm in the 1 to 5 category as well.
David, this is Sandra. I think this is an interesting question because I would say that the PR responses over the years have obviously improved. So it would be interesting to compare this question maybe 10 years ago to what it would be today. It would be a lot different.
That's a good point, because we all have different views of what's poor. It used to be once you lost my data, you were poor no matter what. So, but we'll get into that. Okay. So what we are going to cover today overall is really taking a look at protecting brand and reputation. We're going to discuss balancing legal and regulatory requirements with the breach, and discuss the scrutiny that happens to a business post-breach. And what we're also going to get into, which is important, is the insurance coverage. What's out there, what's happening in our recent events affecting insurance and responses to a breach overall. So what I'm going to get into now is a little bit of the history and how the breach has changed or evolved through the years. And I wonder if Sandra can take the first lead on this and kind of walk us through a brief history of PR breaches.
Sure. Thanks, David. Well, I would say, a data breach incident was no different for communications professionals than other crises in terms of following best practices and our role in managing a crisis. So initially, I think comms professionals approached it, in the way they would any other breach or any other incident. However, there are always nuances to an effective response depending on the industry and the type of crises. And a data breach had particular factors communications professionals had to consider. So one of those was obviously the more technical aspects of what happened and working with forensics, for example, and really understanding how the intrusion happened and what happened to the data, and then being able to deliver the information to the media and the public. So certainly there's been an evolution of how to respond and what a response requires over the years. I would say a few occurrences that shaped changes to communications responses included, really I'm going back to when the first big breach happened, which can be said was in 2005. It was a shoe retailer that compromised more than 1 million records. That was about the first time that more than 1 million records had been exposed. It was also the year that a first data breach affected a university, and then this sort of boom got louder in June 2005 when hackers exposed about 40 million credit card accounts from a payment card processor. Another occurrence, I'd say, was the interest and expertise of journalists who cover the topic and the growth of outlets in that space. So, for example, one of the most widely read cybersecurity news sites on the web, Dark Reading, launched in 2006. And then in 2009, an investigative journalist named Brian Krebs left the Washington Post to launch his own blog called KrebsOnSecurity.com. And he, in fact, was the journalist that broke the story in 2013 that Target had been breached. And then he also identified later that the data was being sold on the black market by someone in Ukraine. So he became, a big player in the media space in terms of exploring and investigating breaches, and then being one to expose companies that sometimes didn't even know that they had a breach, which was interesting, or leaking it out before the company was ready to announce it. So this started the dynamic for PR professionals that you really had to consider that your breach could be leaked to the public before you were ready to announce it, if you were going to at all. And essentially, it really could be worse to not announce it, but then have it discovered by a media outlet and then face the criticism for trying to hide it. And then on that note, that is also one of the biggest factors that affected communications was any legislative and regulatory changes that happened over the years, which companies had to reveal breaches really due to laws as well as public pressure. Just to elaborate on that, one of the big regulations that everyone knows about that took place was the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, in 2018. So that was a huge change that it really brought an obligation in the EU to report every data breach. And up until then, there was really no obligation for organizations in the EU or who had data from consumers in the EU to notify privacy regulators or the affected people of breaches. Today, you will still find various levels of a communication response, from an announcement via press release to really no announcement at all. But still, PR professionals are in a ready posture to answer questions and activate more communications as needed. So you really have to be ready for the full gamut from the onset. And PR is certainly part of the response team now, and preparation in general is much better than it was years ago, obviously. At Experian, we conduct studies with the Ponemon Institute every year, and so this has provided some context to the changes. And so, for example, in 2013, 61% of respondents had a data breach plan in place, but going to 2019, that increased to 91%. So I think that you can assume as part of a breach plan, the PR communications component is in there, and it has obviously been addressed and improved over the years. I think one of the other biggest factors affecting communications over the years was the growth of the 24/7 news cycle and the influence of social media. News and consumer criticism can spread so quickly and can really damage your brand in a matter of minutes. In fact, one of our studies, again with the Ponemon Institute, respondents ranked data breaches among the top 3 incidents that impact brand reputation. So that's a little bit, I think, of context for our further discussion today. And with that, I'll kick it to Jamie for any additional comments.
Yeah, Sandra, that's great. Definitely a comprehensive view of sort of the history, and I agree about how it's evolved over the years in terms of communications response. The only thing I'd add that's really interesting is how communications response has evolved even in the last few months in the COVID environment, because the intersection of cyber and COVID has not only led to increased frequency and complexity of these issues, but they're also adding additional reputational pressure on organizations. So while the basic principles of breach communications, like focusing on the facts and emphasizing action-oriented messaging, remain fundamental today, we're also seeing the need for communication strategies to evolve to consider the other aspects of reputational risk that these security issues are leading to. So for example, if you take a look at ransomware in particular, where we've seen a significant spike, especially the last few months, there are often 2 communications paths that organizations need to be thinking about. The security side, how we're going to talk about the actual security event, but also the operational impact. And so we're seeing organizations, especially in the healthcare space, needing to communicate strategically about ransomware and the impacts not only from the security side, but how it's affecting their supply chain, their manufacturing process, especially as essential businesses. So I think that's the other aspect that's been interesting to watch in terms of evolution, is how these issues don't just stop at the security part, but can lead to other aspects of reputational considerations.
So in listening to both of you, would you say that the press and social media help push communication on breaches to the next level rather than the size of the breaches? Because it's almost like they got caught with their hand in the cookie jar or something went bad, that once people started asking questions, they had to have a certain correct response. Is that, would you say it's a true statement, a bad statement? Did the press and social media really make the companies accountable for what was going on?
Yes, in part, absolutely. Sorry, Jamie. I'll just chime in real quick. I think absolutely it was two-pronged. I think one was the sizes. Certainly that just got on the nation's radar when millions and millions of records were exposed, but then also the intensity and scrutiny of media and just the impact of social media where consumers can criticize and voice their concerns, and that sort of snowballs into, something really, really big for a brand's reputation.
Yeah, I totally agree, Sandra. I think those two factors, plus, of course, those brands that already have either equity, good equity or poor equity, also are, targets in terms of media exposure and therefore need to be, as prepared as possible for these issues.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you have some brand equity, that could make a difference. Okay, we are next going to go into our next poll for all the listeners. When communicating publicly about a cyber incident, it is most important to consider. Now, on this panel, we're going to have probably agreement and maybe disagreement or differing of opinions about what is important, but we'd love to hear from what the listeners think. Does anyone on the panel have a thought or two?
So this is Gina. It's really tough because there's this inherent tension, and I'm a lawyer, so there's an inherent tension in what's required to be put out there publicly by various laws, including laws that require immediate notice. So, for example, HIPAA, under certain circumstances, would require you to publicly go out there and tell on yourself and to announce that you've had this issue. And there's a tension between what's required and what you would typically not ever say publicly if you were expecting a potential legal investigation or lawsuit to flow from the incident. And then also needing to protect your brand, because what's the bigger risk to your company? Is the bigger risk potential legal or regulatory action, or is the bigger risk the harm reputationally, and is there a way to marry this? So when I look at this poll question, I am really torn between the first one, brand and reputation, and then regulatory requirements, which then makes me feel like I'm a horrible person because the last one is the individuals who had their data compromised or stolen. But I will say this, I've handled hundreds of data breaches, and typically there isn't a tiable harm that flows to the individuals whose information was potentially exposed. Often because I think in a lot of these breaches where notification goes out, it's often done not because you've confirmed that the data has left, but because you cannot confirm that it hasn't left. And as we're seeing more and more, the increase in ransomware attacks, and I think Jamie mentioned that earlier, the focus is shifting for these bad actors. They really want to just extort money. And sometimes there's personal data becomes a casualty of that. So we're seeing more and more where the threat actors going in, they're not really looking for the personal data per se. They are obviously looking to encrypt everything and bring the company to its knees so that it has no choice but to pay the ransom. So that's why I wouldn't actually say that the most important thing to consider is the individuals, although that's obviously part of it and should be part of your notification strategy, is making sure you're thinking of those individuals. But that would be the most important thing on this poll for me.
Great. Let me transition over to the next topic, if I can just keep you on the line. Now, we're going to speak to the good versus the bad. So, my personality, I always tend to remember the bad, but there's always plenty of good that happens out there, and things that, breaches that are big but may tend to go away, or as we mentioned earlier, brand equity might be come into effect. Could you start us off where what you see a world-class breach communication might look like? If you could start us off, Gina.
Sure. So world-class breach communication. I mean, unfortunately, I think that what gets attention from the media and what is sort of a new twist on an old story is a fact pattern that's different from your run-of-the-mill breach. At this point, I think we have many people in the public who are used to getting breach notification letters, And all the notification letters kind of look the same. And I think in some ways that's driven by legal requirements, but it's also intentional because you don't necessarily want your breach communication to stand out. That being said, I, unlike a lot of lawyers, do think from a reputational perspective and frankly from a legal perspective, because people are more likely to sue you if they're upset about the way you handled something, also if they can make a lot of money, right? But, particularly for, companies like doctors' offices and companies where individuals actually have a relationship with the owners as opposed to big retailers, if you handle notification in a way that is very direct, that acknowledges the issue, that, tells people a bit more information about the risk to their information, whether it was one of these things where they definitely confirmed that the data was taken versus we simply couldn't rule it out and we believe that the target of this attack was monetary extortion, or we believe that the target of this attack was diverting employee paychecks and not getting customer personal data or something like that. And you don't see that very often. And there are obviously risks to doing that. But it's very hard, per my earlier comments, for people to understand when they get a breach notification letter, do I really need to be concerned? Or is it one of those situations where your systems were ransomed and you happen to also store somewhere within your huge network some of my personal information? I think poor breach communications are ones, obviously, that don't comply with the law because then you run, the risk of a regulatory fine and being non-compliant with breach notification laws. But there are also ones that I think don't accept some responsibility. They say you don't want to apologize because that's an admission of liability, but therein lies the tension I mentioned earlier where the notification laws essentially require you to own responsibility for the breach. And yet, when you're trying to defend yourself in a lawsuit, you don't really want to have, your we're so sorry we messed up front and center. But that might actually be the better strategy from a communications perspective, non-legally. So there's a lot of tension, and this is why it becomes so tricky, particularly, we've got a breach right now where we're still addressing the breach and there's a lawsuit, and we are addressing these issues every single day on that case.
Wow. So to take a step back, I'm going to get Jamie next, but you said, just to confirm for those people who may not be that involved with breaches, why don't you want your breach notification letter to be noticed? Why do you want to go sort of anonymous?
Yeah, so if you are sending, you want to have the breach communication, and I'm referring to the letter to individuals. You want that to be fairly bland and benign, and you want it to look like everybody else's so that there's nothing in there that stands out. Because the more people pay attention, the longer they think about what they've read, the risk gets higher that you might be the target of a lawsuit, or they might get upset enough that they go to their neighbor or their brother's friend from college who's a lawyer and they say, hey, can you take a look at this? What should I do? And then you're sort of raising that risk that someone's going to start saying, maybe we should sue this company over this issue. And I think Jamie probably has some good insight on this because I've worked with Adelman quite a bit. And, typically you want the story to die and you want to fly under the radar from an attention perspective while also satisfying your legal obligations, of course. But from an attention perspective, I think you want to fly under the radar because your company certainly will not be the only company to have a data breach that day or let alone that month or that year. And it's the companies that stand out that tend to get more attention and often tend to be the target of increased risk along the lines of an investigation or lawsuit.
Yeah, Jamie, we'd love to hear your thoughts on it, and if you have any other, we put the bullet point in there, but if you have any stories or anonymous stories about bad or poor breaches, love to hear it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Gina in terms of the strategy should really be how do you take the oxygen out of the fire of these issues because they're so commonplace. And so part of that is not over-calibrating, not standing out in terms of a public perception. And I totally agree about the increased value of the direct clear communications with affected individuals, because at the end of the day, that's where trust is going to be won or lost. That's who is either going to decide to go on social media and blast your brand or not because they feel satisfied with your response. The other thing I'd say in terms of communication strategy, both good or bad, not just thinking about the external stakeholder communication strategy, but where we see a lot of companies go wrong is not adequately considering the internal communication strategy, how they're going to properly equip and guide their customer-facing employees about how to handle the incoming inquiries from customers and others. And often this is guiding employees about what we don't want them to say as much as it is about what we do want them to say. So I've been involved in several situations where, clients thought they had this great communication strategy ready to go, and then one anonymous employee talks to the media about things are out of control here, we don't know what's going on, and that will undermine trust at the end of the day. So, the thing we think about is sort of that inside-out communications is really critical to whether it's going to be a poor or an effective communications response at the end of the day.
Do they listen to you? Or is it usually an uphill battle?
Yeah, well, the way we get them to listen is we sort of will often put together what those worst case scenario headlines are when you have sort of a rogue employee, and we don't even have to make them up because there's plenty of examples. There was the MedStar Health attack a couple of years ago. Those were all the headlines about employees describing the disarray. And so we'll show those to organizations to say, let's not get to this point. So what can we do right now, to prevent that from happening?
Kim, so from the insurance perspective, you have a lot of experience with clients and customers and insureds on your side. So in working with a client and your vendors, do they listen on your side? What you see from insurance?
Well,
glad I'm making everyone laugh asking these questions.
Right. I'd like to say everyone listens, but I think I would echo Gina and Jamie's sentiments and comments. I think good breach communication historically, as I've always seen it, involves collaboration behind the scenes, good collaboration between counsel, client, the insured, and vendors where appropriate. Ideally, breach counsel and vendors tailored with healthcare breach experience and expertise because there were myriad, as Gina and Jamie know, concerns and issues in the healthcare industry vertical with respect to breach response and good communication because of the multiple different layers of stakeholders to consider. So typically, the best outcomes are when that good collaboration happens behind the scenes so that it seems seamless and very effective on the other side as the actual communication goes out. The scenarios that typically don't go well that I have seen over the years are when the insured tends to go it alone, which I know is something that probably keeps Gina and Jamie up at night when they don't have that level of cooperation and collaboration at the outset. So.
Great. Sandra, you've handled many breaches and your company is very well known. Do you have any thoughts on what goes well, what doesn't go well, or any stories you'd like to share?
Well, from my perspective, what I can share is that, like the other panelists just mentioned in terms of collaboration, that's really important for the company that has been breached and then all of your external partners. So that's where we as Experian come in, right? And so from a PR perspective, our clients hadn't really realized, for example, that media will reach out to us as, the resolution provider. We often provide identity protection products to the affected consumers, or we are the call center for those consumers, et cetera. And so media will call our PR department asking questions about the breach, and also, maybe saying or asking the same question to the client. And so if we don't collaborate and are in sync on that, then that could pose a lot of problems. So it's very important that you're aware that your partners externally are essentially part of your breach or part of this ecosystem to the public, and make sure to collaborate, have a plan in place. And so where I've come in and had best practices with clients is making sure that they're aware, making sure they're aware of all of the typical media outlets that cover breaches. You know, they're always focused on just the media in their industry. So whether it's retail or healthcare, you know, they're worried about the media that talk to them and, let's say, cover their news all the time. But then there's this whole other world of media that like to cover breaches, and then obviously, as I mentioned before, are investigative and are looking to expose breaches where they haven't been announced yet. So, you know, you can get a lot of learnings and benefits from opening up your team to make sure that your partners are included in that.
Great. That's a good segue to our next slide. So I'll turn it over to Jamie. So in experience, people, companies and people at times too, they're they feel bad. They're sorry. They lost something. Can you say you're sorry now in today's environment? Start with Jamie.
Yeah. So, you know, I think, and this is exactly where we want to be in lockstep, you know, with the legal perspective on these issues, because yes, from a reputation standpoint, it is important to demonstrate to individuals that we're taking this seriously. We regret any concern or inconvenience this caused, but we'd want to also help lawyers like Gina protect the insured from potential litigation and regulatory scrutiny. So, you know, to the points that have been already made, this is where that behind-the-scenes collaboration is so critical. I think there's a misconception that the legal and PR strategies are in opposition to each other, because at the end of the day, we all have the same goal, which is to mitigate risk, whether that's risk in terms of litigation, regulatory scrutiny, or impacts to brand reputation. So, you know, one of the things we like to do right away when we get involved in an incident is make sure we are in lockstep with counsel on what are the notification requirements at play, what are the disclosure deadlines we need to keep in mind, and what are the unique aspects of messaging that we should be mindful of in the event this ends up in litigation. And we recognize that sometimes the litigation and the regulatory scrutiny comes from a poor messaging strategy or a poor communications response. And so all the more reason to make sure these two pieces are in sync so the right hand knows what the left hand is doing. But Gina and I work together a lot, and I would, you know, we happen to like each other, so that helps, but I'm curious, you know, what your thoughts are on this as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Jamie. I think that ultimately you are working towards the same goal. You have to be realistic about what is required to be said, and then you have to weigh the risk of saying something additional to the requirements and whether that's going to work for or against you in the court of law and in the court of public perception. So yeah, absolutely agree with you.
So for a question for both of you, so when a breach happens, there's usually someone who's in charge and someone who should be. So when you're looking at these, we'll start with Jamie, who usually runs the communications? And is it the person you're dealing with usually the correct person?
So, you know, I'm not saying this to butter up Gina, I promise, but I actually feel that counsel should be quarterbacking a lot of this because, you know, they do understand both the regulatory and, you know, legal requirements and then sort of the communications considerations. So, you know, sometimes though, internal or external counsel on these issues aren't as readily involved, and I think that ultimately is a mistake. And so, of course, I do feel that the communications and PR people need to have an important seat at the table, but definitely feel that legal needs to be driving a lot of this.
Yeah, I would agree, and not just because it's self-serving. So we've had experiences where clients have brought us in right away, and the outcomes are typically better because we're always reviewing every step of the investigatory process with an eye towards risk of public disclosure, whether it's a legal requirement to disclose versus, you know, you have someone who picks up the story and runs with it. on social media or in one of the blogs or one of the publications. And so I think that ideally you would have somebody very early on in the process looking at everything 2 or 3 steps down the road with an eye towards possibly, what story will we be telling at some point in time, and how do we defend the actions we took? Because typically, everybody, I think at this point, no one's really surprised when breaches happen. I think that there's forgiveness in society when something goes wrong, or, you get attacked, particularly if it's from a highly sophisticated threat actor. I do think that people tend to still very much hold companies accountable for how they respond. And I always say there's 2 things that really make a difference in whether a company emerges from a breach relatively unscathed versus really impacted detrimentally by it. The first is timing. So when you knew you had an issue, how quickly did you respond to investigate, to bring in the appropriate parties, to make sure you were evaluating all of your potential legal obligations? If you're B2B, how quickly did you notify your business partners that there was an issue with their data? So that's number one. And if you took a long time and you don't have a good story to tell, that can really, really subject you to criticism. The other issue is communication. So how did you communicate once you knew you had to communicate it? And were you cohesive in your message along the way? Did you disclose information before your investigation was done? And if you did those facts change? And that has happened. There's a very, very public breach of a large retailer that, most women in America in particular love. And I'm not using their name because of firm client reasons. And we didn't handle this breach. But they came out very early defensively and gave a number of credit cards that had been impacted. And that number turned out to be wrong. It was understated. And I know how this happens. You have somebody in the room. It's often, somebody senior who says, well, gosh, we have to say something. We have to say something. They were probably told, it's probably not a great idea since we're still investigating. Or maybe they thought the investigation was over and they had enough information. And then actually facts change rapidly when you're investigating. And so it turns out that was not the right number. And the problem is the outcome there is either you look disorganized, like you didn't competently conduct your investigation, which is often not true. It's just you hadn't finished it. Or you look like you lied. And that is a very bad outcome, is to look like you were being dishonest. And I know how this happens. Neither of those were intentional. But that's just the way that it plays out when you are struggling to respond, when you're under the gun, and you feel that your back's against a wall because the public has already been made aware of your breach, and now what do you do with it?
Yeah, it seems like a simple concept, but it doesn't always work out that way because people do have to worry about their reputations. So reputational harm is, it's fairly new in the grand scheme of things to insurance, but it's been around a little bit. But I'll ask him. So in looking at it from an insurance perspective, what should people and companies consider or be mindful of with reputational harm?
Sure. Well, reputational harm coverage, as we know, Dave, is broadly offered in the market today. It has been for some time, but the wording still is not standard or consistent from carrier to carrier. So I think the most key things to look for are clear wording that outlines how and when a policy is going to be triggered and what the insured is going to need to do to satisfy any requirements for that coverage. It's important to do that because that, at the outset, is going to allow a more smooth claim experience on the back end. And that's really where we've historically seen a lot of these claims. There hasn't been a huge frequency of reputational harm claims, but a lot of them have stalled, or there's been a lot of disappointment in terms of outcome because there hasn't been clarity on the coverage, how it's triggered, when it's triggered, and what the insured needs to do for their part to let claims actually do their job. So I think those are the most important things that I would hope the market would become synced up and consistent about sooner rather than later.
Good. Sandra, are there industry sectors or market sectors that you think have more than other sections of exposure to reputational harm?
Well, I think it matters on really the kind of data that was exposed. I think it's really the number one factor. So whether it was retail or an FI or healthcare, et cetera, if the information was just name and email address, obviously that doesn't have as much of an impact and garner the consumer backlash as if it were social security number, banking information. So I think that's really the key in terms of the amount of harm that a company can suffer.
Okay. What we're going to do next is our next polling question. And for everyone, do you have breach fatigue? Now, I'm not going to put the panelists because this is how we earn a living. But, for those are customers.
I just have fatigue generally. Does that I have COVID fatigue. How's that?
Yeah.
This is Kim. I would say that I wish I had fatigue, but I don't. And I would just say that for the healthcare industry, which is all that TDC specialty focuses on, it's hard to get breach fatigue when there's so many different exposures and issues that are impacting the healthcare sector. And in large part, many published studies have shown that upwards of a quarter of patients report that they would change their healthcare provider after a breach. And that portends for a potentially significant impact from a business perspective to healthcare organizations in particular. So I would just make the comment that as compared to maybe consumers in other industry sectors like retail and such, there's a really significant exposure for reputational harm impact in the healthcare space. And I think we're starting to see that more and more in the current environment too. But.
Good points. So in the being wary of the time that we have left, I'm going to ask the panel to give their thoughts about the future. So we just addressed breach fatigue, but I'll start with Gina. Gina, do you have any future trends that you can see happening in your realm with breaches and communications? Or is there anything that might change consumers' mindsets about breaches? Is it biometric data? Is it, no, that's not going to matter. So if you wouldn't mind starting us off.
Sure. So I think the biggest trend that we're already seeing, so it's not like I've got a crystal ball, although I did predict it last year, along with anyone else who is in this space, is an increase in data breach litigation. So our firm has historically studied year over year the number of publicly reported data breaches and the number of class action breach lawsuits filed in a given period. And what had held steady for the 7 or so years we looked at this, year over year, was the risk of being sued in comparison to the number of publicly reported breaches was about 4 to 7%. So, and there's different reasons for that. Most of it is that the law had not really caught up to the potential harm of a data breach. So you have issues of standing, and the lawyers who are listening to this will know what I'm talking about, probably the claims people too, issues of standing. So are you actually injured even though you know that your information may have been exposed? Have you suffered an injury? And also damages, which is kind of the same analysis as well. So California, when it passed the California Consumer Privacy Act in effective January of 2020, is the first law to provide a private right of action in the United States for individuals who certain types of their personal information have been breached. And so it's not all personal data. It's, sensitive. It's the SSNs. It's the driver's license numbers, that kind of thing. But they can get between, I think it's, I'm blanking on $150 and $700, or $100 and $750 in statutory damages, depending on the egregiousness of the violation. And that has made suing companies who have reported a breach in California, which if it's 500 or more, you have to report to the AG, and then they post it on their website, so it reads like a who's who list of defendants. And then, we're seeing a big uptick in class action lawsuits. So I think we looked at this a couple of weeks ago, and about 30% of companies who are reporting breaches in California are getting sued. And that's a big increase. And so I don't see that going away. There's a lot of discussion in other states about passing similar laws. By the way, that statutory damages range is only permitted for California residents. But other states are looking at it. The federal government has, once again, people always ask me, is the federal government going to pass a national data breach law or a national privacy law? And I'm like, I don't know that I have much faith in the federal government to pass anything these days, but they tend to come down to two issues. One is preemption. So would a federal law preempt the state law or cancel it out, right? So that only the federal law applies. Or if you have a state law that is more, I would say, protective maybe of the consumers, that requires more, provides more rights, does that still stand despite the existence of the federal law? And the other issue is a private right of action. Would the federal law do something similar to the CCPA and provide affected individuals with the right to recover statutory damages even in the absence of any actual harm? And so, again, I'm not trying to be too cynical. It's just I've seen this kind of almost every legislative session. They go and start talking about this again. It's not happened. But for the most part, litigation, we're going to see an increase in it, and it's not going away, unfortunately.
Well, Kim, Gina's prediction must make you feel very good from an insurance carrier. So,
sorry, Kim.
No. I don't disagree with Gina's points at all, but I'll take a more focused tack on a trend and say that I think, not just in the healthcare industry, but across industries, telemedicine, telehealth is widely touted right now as being here to stay, as is remote working for many people, and likely only to increase in frequency of usage going forward. But as individuals continue to access telehealth, telemedicine via their personal or at-home devices, often much less secure than workplace system devices and pathways, there is likely going to be more frequent breaches of those personal devices, and many individuals may not even realize how much of their PHI or PII is getting downloaded or shared when they launch various apps on their smartphones or tablets in order to engage in telemedicine, telehealth appointments. So I think much is still going to need to be learned and much education still to be done towards a goal of less data privacy and security exposure despite increased use of mobile and personal devices and home networks for telemedicine interactions. And that could change some people's mindsets going forward as they learn how much of their data is being shared, which maybe they weren't aware of. So that's something I think to watch, because these provider portals that are often set up for ease of access, I think my crystal ball is a little foggy on this point, but it's getting clearer by the day. I think that's going to be an issue that's going to impact Gina, Jamie, Sandra, and myself. So,
those are good points. Sandra, from your perspective, do you see anything that would change our mind as consumers, or any trends you might be seeing or think you might be seeing?
Well, I'll touch on the breach fatigue here, the first point, in terms of on the business side or the company side, I don't think that there's fatigue. In fact, I think companies are, really focusing on shoring up their cybersecurity more and more. And I know from the studies that we've done that are yearly, we've seen companies have more of an investment, whether it's in technology or just different resources every year. That has gone up in the last 7 years that we've done our corporate preparedness study. And I think that they realize that cyber criminals are just increasingly getting more sophisticated. They're always one step ahead. So that is not going to suffer any fatigue. Now, consumers, on the other hand, I feel like do have a little bit of fatigue. We've done some consumer surveys and have seen that for the most part, consumers don't even read sometimes the notification letters and don't act on it in terms of the offer that the company may be made for an identity protection product or the steps that they need to take to protect themselves, et cetera. That has been lacking as years have gone by. So, you know, from a communications perspective, it's important to consider that whatever information you're delivering, consumers may not react to it right away or may not really pay that much attention, and you'll want to maybe take some other steps just to make sure that they have the information, whether it's putting up a website FAQ page, having a call center available, making sure your notification letter is very clear and concise, et cetera. The other point I'll just make is that from a PR perspective, and this is already, I think, you know, relatively known, that you really have to have a social media plan in place. It's not just about the media and the journalists, it's also about the consumers and what reaction they'll have on social media. So how are you going to monitor that? How are you going to respond to consumers on social media, et cetera? That's a very big component that I think has increasingly become more important over the years.
I think that's true, because I think 10 to 15 years ago, during the earlier breaches that we're mentioning, there was no social media. Jamie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with my
for the future?
I agree with my fellow panelists. The only other thing I would say is sort of the digital transformation that the COVID environment has accelerated. Not only are we seeing that with telehealth and telemedicine, but also starting to see that in the financial services sector with the increased speed of transition towards digital banking. So this is likely going to result in consumer concerns, not just about security and breaches, but on the front end. How are companies protecting my privacy? How are they using my data? And so I think it'll be incumbent on organizations to not wait for the breach to think about their communication strategy. They should just be thinking now, how are they going to answer these tough questions from consumers and employees today about what data they have, why they have it, are they sharing it with third parties, and consider a more proactive positioning plan around privacy that will, of course, need to balance all the considerations we talked about today from a legal and reputational perspective.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Well, thank you, everyone, for your time. Yeah, it was an excellent panel. Let's go to some live questions. Okay, so now we're at the end of the panel. We have some questions either through the chat and some I would like to ask. So I'm going to open up this question to the entire panel. So breaches, obviously, that we spoke about have changed, but in today's world, there is a lot of cloud computing, web hosting, a lot of data that is out there being hosted by third parties. So I wanted to ask that, are you seeing difference in breaches where you have a B2B or a B2C difference? So you have one business that needs to notify another business, we had a breach, we lost your customer data better compared to what is normally like a business to consumer or client data breach. So are you noticing differences in the way you approach them? The way the consumers respond, the customers respond? I'd like to hear from you guys what you think some of the differences are that you're seeing. And we'll start with Kim.
Sure. Well, in terms of B2B or B2C, I would say an overarching theme is the need to really quell a lot of internal traffic in terms of chatter and messaging and noise. In terms of emails that go back and forth, often sometimes blaming, sometimes asking how did this happen, what's going on. That often creates a lot of difficulty on the back end in terms of responding to the breach, in terms of liability that an organization will have. I think Gina certainly can probably speak to that, creating headaches for her, but that's something that is important, whether it's B2B or B2C, that be consistently, I think, adhered to, which is quelling a lot of internal email traffic, which is a natural human inclination at the outset, but really has been problematic universally. Gina, I don't know if you have some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I always say that unfortunately the B2B breaches tend to be more expensive, and there are several reasons for this. I mean, one, you are stuck notifying all of your business clients, and then they may have their own views and strategies for how to notify, if at all, the individuals connected with the breach. So if you think, you've got the service provider, they're notifying, let's say, their 100 business clients. Each of those 100 business clients is going to have a view as to how best to communicate this. They will also demand that that service provider provide information, and some of the information that needs to be disclosed may be required by contract. So a data security addendum may say you have to disclose the following, 8 pieces of information. And in reality, these are your clients. So you're going to want to be cooperative and assist them with whatever they need in order to help them address the breach on their end. And yet you have no control over what they are going to say to the individuals. And frankly, I've seen in many instances where the business client wants to put as much distance between the breach and themselves as possible. So they will often, I don't want to say throw the service provider under the bus, but they will certainly push the blame onto the service provider. So, one thing that a lot of service providers will do is draft their own template notifications to the individual so that at least they can both assist their clients and maintain some of the control over the messaging. But it gets a little dicey because if the service provider is then sued, you now have all of this information where you're walking a tightrope between being really fulsome in what you're sharing because you either have to or you want to share that with your business client, and yet not wanting to put too much information out there that could ultimately disadvantage you if there's a lawsuit. So it's a very tricky situation, and we deal with this a lot. And there's some good strategies for handling it, where you can walk out having your client feel pretty good about how you communicated and how you responded. And there's also a lot of opportunity to blow up those relationships if the communication doesn't work in the way that the client wants it to.
Great. Jamie, are you seeing a difference between the two? Does one make one feel more sorry than the other, or do they have the same approach?
Yeah, I mean, piggybacking off of what Gina shared, for B2C organizations, in many ways, the communications cascade is easier because it's a direct line between the organization and the impacted consumer. But for B2B incidents, the matrix of stakeholders is murkier. So in addition to focusing on the direct to business client communications, it's critical to determine the owners of communications to the various stakeholders and iron out that communications coordination in advance of an announcement. So B2B organizations need to work out with their business clients how these communications are going to be cascaded to any end users whose information may be impacted and who's going to manage any media inquiries. So where we see this coordination lacking is where it would end up resulting in inconsistent messaging in the public domain, which can eventually erode trust. So this is, again, where that theme of advanced preparation is so critical.
So Sandra, when you're handling the breaches from your perspective, are they coordinated, or do you see differences between the two, or are they similar?
Well, I would say it does add various more layers, right? For example, if the breach was a vendor or supplier, a third party, that breached some information that they had of yours, and then it affected maybe even other B2B companies and or consumers. So all that's to say it can be a little more complicated, and I agree when it's just B2C, the cascading of information is easier. One comment that I have is that it's really important that the companies and the legal teams allow PR professionals from each of the respective organizations, talk to each other and be able to synchronize, because the consistency in the information and messaging that goes out, whether it's going out first to the B2B audience and then therefore to the consumer audience, is critical. And I find it interesting and surprising that many times, for some reason, PR professionals are blocked from corresponding intimately with each other. And it's a detriment, because we are essentially, in somewhat of our own world, right? And we talk the same language and we understand each other and what our remit is. And we're both going to have ultimately the same goal of protecting our respective organizations' brand and reputation and doing what's right for the affected parties. So it's critical that from the very onset, all of the communications professionals be at the table and be allowed to work and collaborate very closely together.
I think that's the theme I'm hearing through the whole panel is communication, whether you need to control it or just collaborate with the different organizations that are involved and different departments are involved in a breach, that it can't be coordinated, collaborated, done together, and communicated enough. So thank you all for your time. Thanks, Kim, Gina, Jamie, and Sandra. I appreciate you guys joining the panel, giving your thoughts. And I'd like to thank Net Diligence and the team that put this webinar together. It went great, very seamless, and easy to do. So thank you, everyone, for your time.